Good afternoon. I'm John Hart, the co-founder of C3 Solutions, the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, and the editor of our news magazine, C3. Welcome to another edition of Right Voices, our podcast interview series where we highlight conservative leaders and ideas in the climate debate. Today, we're honored to be joined by Representative Peter Meijer, who's serving his first term as Michigan's third congressional representative. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what I want to talk to you about is the conservative movement is at a bit of a crossroads, and you're really at a busy intersection, to put it mildly. You've got a tough primary challenge. You're trying to, I think, shape what the future of the party ought to look like. And one of the things that you've done is join the Conservative Climate Caucus. We were actually in Utah together last year briefly. I'd love to get your perspective on why you joined that caucus and why you think it's important for conservative leaders to highlight the issue of climate.
Well, you mentioned those crossroads, and there's a couple of different, I don't know, to extend that metaphor, vehicles at that intersection. And some of that has to do with, an affinity towards the question of, are you a more personality-based party or more policy-based? And then when it comes to, if policy-based, what exactly are those policies, right? So a lot of things are up for reimagining. And I am very much a proponent that, and David Shore, the kind of center-left political analyst, just had a great research paper coming out kind of affirming this. 3/4 of elections are won not by base turnout, but by persuading, independents, that marginal voter, getting them to come over and join your side. Right. And if we are on the Republican side of the aisle to be a party that continues to win those marginal elections, we have to look at where up and coming voters are and try to persuade them with a message that resonates with them. So the politics, to me, of embracing not only conservatism's and the Republican Party's long history of conservation and environmental protection, not only embracing that, but extending that forward and reflecting, frankly, where the country is. I mean, I think that is a political imperative and a moral imperative as well.
Mm-hmm. I'd be curious, I'll put you on the spot a little bit. How would you define conservatism, and what do you think conservatism ought to be? Because as you know very well in your district, in your race this year, some people define conservatism as loyalty to one particular individual. Others define it more as loyalty to a set of ideas and the Constitution. How do you articulate what you think conservatism ought to be, and what type of leader you want to be?
I mean, not to be too philosophical, but I mean, I guess some could define themselves or that to be a conservative means you must do X, Y, or Z. And I think that you lose any sense of political philosophy or underpinning. I mean, at my core, I think a conservative looks at all of the things that are working well in this country and says, if we're going to change something, let's be very humble, let's be very delicate, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's an appreciation, a sense of gratitude, before we change something, kind of the Chesterton's fence, right? It's before anything is modified, understand exactly how it came to be and what its upside is, even if the downside is very evident, right? I mean, you want to be deliberate, you want to be careful, or the standing athwart history, yelling stop, or at the very least slow down. Let's be mindful that everything has an equal and opposite reaction. So I think that, to me, is intrinsically very conservative. Now, what policy positions you overlay onto that are, I think, a matter for debate, and I think a debate is welcome and positive. But I don't think there's any world in which, or any idol worship is not conservative.
Yeah. Right. I mean, my approach, and I worked for Senator Tom Coburn for years. He was a member of the class of 1994, and I think what that class understood, and it was I called it populism with portfolio, as opposed to populism without portfolio, because oftentimes there's just a populist reaction without a set of policies that drive the debate forward.
And populism, I mean, to your point on a portfolio,
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you have a political philosophy that maybe is infused with populism or tries to seek a broader audience, that's one thing. But if you start from a populist standpoint, you're inherently without position, because if that position falls out of favor, it's discarded very quickly, right? I mean, it's a churn.
Right. And of course, the flip side is you have to have popular support for your ideas in order to be successful. And I think, and back on the climate energy, I think I'd love to get your take on, again, going forward, this midterm election cycle and in the future. You have a background in military intelligence, if I remember correctly. And what is your take on how the war in Ukraine has shaped and changed the energy debate, climate debate, particularly in the U.S., but around the world, and how is that impacting constituents in your district, and how do you think that you ought to respond to that?
Well, it's like that old Warren Buffett, quote, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked, right? When times are tough, you see which positions are deeply held and which ones were, more superficial. It's very easy for somebody who lives in a large metropolitan area where they are not, where the Metro card pricing is relatively static depending on the MTA's finances, but not beholden as much to the whims of international commodities markets in the way that somebody who is commuting to work every day is going to see that reflected. And, just to put it bluntly, I mean, I think there's an imperative to be tackling climate change and to be ensuring we have the best policies and that we're making progress. If I don't think you'd find a single poll, maybe a poll among college undergraduates, but apart from that, any real subset or voting demographic that would list climate change as their top 5 issues right now, right? Yeah. So in some ways, it becomes perceived as more of a luxury topic. And I think that's in the wake of the war in Ukraine, spiking commodities prices, globally, which especially in the energy sector had been rising prior to this. I mean, I think I largely attribute that to 2 factors. I mean, one was coming out of COVID, the transportation sector restarting, increasing demand while supply still stayed relatively stagnant. But then number 2, the way the Biden administration had approached or had at least messaged and frankly in policies as well, how they had been discouraging investment and causing a lot of the large energy producers to basically hedge their bets, right? I mean, if you're told that the president wants to shut down your industry, you're probably not going to plow tens of billions of dollars into capex, right? Like, that's just not something you're going to do. So you had on the one hand, rising demand, stagnant supply, and then the lack of investment because of government messaging and government policies that could match down the line or give that kind of runway for supply and demand to be matched. So I think I don't know that it really changed the equation too much, but to me, it was a very early shock that reflects how important it is to be pragmatic and realistic about what you're trying to do. These are not things that are going to change overnight. These are, if we have a transition occurs gradually, it does not occur quickly. And I think you've seen in some of this administration's messaging around electric vehicles, kind of how ham-fisted and also detached from the reality of much of the American public, conversations that take place within, and I don't mean to deride these large metropolitan areas. I've lived there for plenty of time, but you can be deluded if all the people you're talking to, are that sense of groupthink that comes in just because of how narrow those conversations become. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we did a report, C3 Solutions, that Nick Loris authored called "Free Economies or Clean Economies," that showed that countries that embrace principles of economic freedom, the rule of law, limited government, less taxes, are twice as clean. And and there's something we highlight called the Kuznets curve. And to your point about it's a luxury to focus on.
all the data shows that once an economy develops enough wealth, and that, again, that wealth happens through innovation, policies that facilitate and encourage innovation, then it goes over the curve and develops cleaner energy technologies. So I think to the moment we're in right now, what do you see as some of the policies that could help us be a little more pragmatic? This is an issue set that, I mean, my view, and I'm curious to your take, is that the far left is very ideological and very almost fundamentalist about climate, and that they have these doctrinaire positions of, everything but nuclear, everything but fracking, and there isn't a very rational. And in fact, that position facilitated Putin's invasion to a degree, and that Europe played a shell game. They went, quote, renewable, but they didn't tell their own constituents they were essentially outsourcing or offshoring their carbon emissions to Russia.
Well, and to me, I mean, that gets at the crux of it, right? Like, to me, it's so deeply, incredibly frustrating. Okay, number one, Biden wants to increase renewables and yet has maintained the tariff on imported solar panels. And that just seems incompetent at best, but counterproductive, realistically. Number two, when we are in a crunch, as you saw the administration kind of go hand in hand to the Saudis and to others around the globe and try to say, hey, we're not going to buy from Russia. Can we buy from you? If our goal is climate change, if our goal is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then why the heck are we going to some of the countries with the largest methane emissions kind of per barrel of oil, instead of investing in American producers, right? Because we are both outsourcing the profits, we're outsourcing the jobs, and we are having the same global impact when it comes to global warming, when it comes to the climate, or sorry, a worse global impact when it comes to that because of that increase in methane emissions during that oil and gas E&P cycle. So it is just completely detached from hey, here's where we are, here's where we need to be. I mean, you kind of see the impact of catchphrase or slogan politics that's divorced from any semblance of how the real world operates. Where I think there should be a focus, and there's no partisan objection to this, except for maybe Green New Deal absolutists who believe that absent a fundamental restructuring of the economy, we're never going to get to where we need to be on climate targets. How much do you hear about efficiency, on energy savings, on how electric vehicles and bidirectional charging and DC microgrids and all of the things that are not super sexy, right? They're not nuclear fission, which, if we achieve that will be amazing, but just how we are nuclear fusion, yeah. But how we are, gradually decreasing, our consumption and trying to use, say, larger electric vehicles on the road as batteries for the grid so that you can modulate better between periods of peak consumption and peak production, especially on the renewable side. But no serious person that I've talked to, and many will quietly admit, yeah, we will always need some demand, some form when it comes to the energy grid, some form of on-demand generation. Right. And I think in an ideal world, that's nuclear, that's natural gas. You can kind of arbitrage between the two depending on pricing. And then nuclear is heavily dependent on subsidies. So you need to make sure that you're kind of driving cost efficiencies there. But where is the love for natural gas? I mean, natural gas production is one of the reasons why the US saw a decrease in carbon emissions in the mid 2010s. Right. I mean, this is transformational, and it's also driven a decline in prices. And then you kind of get the sense that there are, and these are not the pollsters, right? But there are some folks within the administration who think that rising gas prices are good because that will accelerate the transition, towards, electric vehicles or away from gas, when, the pain, the economic and political pain from that will live far after, the price increases.
Yeah, it's a pretty cruel and brutal way of trying to change an economy. So I know you've got to go in a minute, but just one last quick question is, the way my theory of what I've seen in these races so far is that there's roughly 25-30% of folks that will vote for whoever Trump says to vote for, but I'm heartened by the fact that 2/3, 75% of voters really do just look at issues like inflation, gas prices, energy policy, and vote for the candidate most equipped to advance solutions in that area. And your point on natural gas is the Trump administration actually did well by bending the knee to traditional constitutional conservatism and embracing in all of the above energy policy. So just in closing, what's your message to people in Michigan who didn't like your vote on impeachment, but ought to like all of your other policy positions, particularly on energy?
Well, yeah, and I give the Trump administration a lot of credit. No, Donald Trump had some weird fixations on shower head efficiency, right, and I think on toilets as well, which we can get into map ratings and some of the 0.8 gallon per flush. I'm a very big fan, not to get into sponsorships here, but Niagara Stealth is one of the best toilets in the world, in my view. And Trump also had a really weird hang up around windmills wind power generation. But everyone has their thing. No, I mean, to your point, I'm not out here to try to be dwelling on the past. I mean, I think it's important that when things are unacceptable, you say that they're unacceptable. But too often, our politics just becomes an effort in chewing the cud over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are sick of it. That's one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump was so popular, is because he represented, not politics as usual. And I think that, frankly, that was a very needed antidote. Now, I think he had a lot of political missed opportunities in there, and I think that there were there were plenty of good. It was not an unalloyed good. But what we need to be focusing on the Republican side of the aisle, is not orienting the party around, in favor of or opposition to a singular individual. I mean, no organization, that has a charismatic founder, a charismatic leader, if they don't have a succession plan, everyone's got, God gives us all term limits on this, blue marble. So where we should be focusing is not on reverting back to the pre-2016 status quo, not thinking that 2017 to 2021 is set in amber and that is the golden age that we should always be worshiping, but frankly saying, how can we take the best of both worlds? How can we be reflective and responsive to the American people, to having policies that actually work rather than a bunch of slogans and catchphrases? And that's going to require a bit more nuance. It's going to require some, what I think could be very productive and lively conversations, but has to get away from the knee-jerk demonization. And I think a lot of Americans reflect with being in a position where they don't want to be viewed so narrowly. They want to have some depth, have some breadth, and that's what we're trying to offer.
Great. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. That's a terrific perspective. And this has been John Hart with Right Voices. You can follow us at C3 Solutions, c3newsmag.com. And we'll hope to have you on again, Congressman.
I would look forward to that. Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to see you again.